Sandra is CMO at Microsoft. Wait, there's so many beautiful titles, and she just recently had a very long tenure at Intel, where you were
Yes. Beautiful company. Both
GM,
magical.
general manager, and you were overseeing sports and technology, which is fascinating, and metaverse, all things metaverse. But that's a different conversation. That's really interesting. Today, we're talking about inclusivity versus diversity, which is a topic that gets a lot of press. It gets a lot of social media pushes. C-suite is always talking about it. But my first question is something really happening? You just gave a beautiful panel discussion in the amphitheater, and you talked about. So let's just say, is this just being talked about, or is diversity and inclusivity really happening at a C-suite level and down?
I always like to look at the actions, and if you look at the 1% who's really informing society, and that means whether it's presidents of countries, board of directors, C-level, it's still predominantly all male, so the answer is no, it's not happening. We all admire the stats, the data, and oftentimes what I hear is there's a challenge in finding talent that's out there. It's out there. You just have to look a little bit harder. Maybe it takes longer to recruit the talent. Retention is an issue because there's always the leaky middle that transpires. So that's really, you start off, you get a diverse composition of talent. You move up the ranks, and there's a point in time where people just decide to exit for various reasons, which then you look at the pipeline, you have a smaller pipeline to go to the C-level and board of directors, but I have a wealth of contacts that I'm happy to recommend for different types of industries, like inside technology, outside of technology. So work to be done. I always admire the male allies that are on our journey. We will not drive change without them. So,
Can you go a little bit into the elite bias you were talking about in the other room?
yeah, I mean, oftentimes when we're designing a product, a service, an experience, it's for a particular segment. And so when you think about that segment, when you peel the onion, you're overlooking, even within that segment, there's probably a sub-segment. And we often say the elite bias is that you're designing for 20% because it generates 80% of the revenue, which makes perfect sense. But think about all the other opportunity loss that happens. I often like to say that, you can you can look at a market such as disability, and you're like, well, why would I design for disability? Well, that smaller segment, the IP or patents you create, can actually surprisingly address a much larger segment. So I always think about what is the opportunity loss? How do you design? Because if you design for the average, you kind of design for no one. And so how do you really think about the broader segment that you're serving and the sub-segments and design for them? And so we look at the elite bias because I highlighted an example in which a particular product, the belief is you're serving a male audience, which in that scenario, it's true. But underneath that data, it was a subset of a male audience, higher educated, more wealthy, et cetera. And so that in itself is you missed another larger population of the male audience.
So how should it be? How do you make product design, more inclusive? And if you could explain the difference between diversity and inclusivity, because I believe you highlight there's a difference.
There is a difference. The first time I really was awakened to the importance of diversity was when I heard an agency called by the name of IDEO. And IDEO takes customer problems and seeks to provide solutions. And the way they do it is they bring a mixture of individuals, ethnographers, people from different industries that are not even related to your industry. And you do that because you look at the problem differently. And so that is diversity of experiences, lived experiences that maybe in the category that I'm in serving, so right now I'm in serving, or maybe let's take the sports industry. If we're all in sports and we have people surrounded by sports, imagine if you bring somebody in the restaurant industry, they can look at the problem like, oh, we can solve it this way, which is much more simplistic because we may have a bias around how the sports industry functions. And so in that essence, we have blinders. So the notion about diversity is just diversity in experiences. It doesn't always have to be an ethnicity. But if you look around the room and like, okay, do I have diversity perspectives? Are we not homogeneous? And then you can have diversity in the room, but the question is, are all the voices being included and heard? And so the inclusivity is, it's interesting. Sometimes you have these introverts that don't say anything, and they have the brightest thing to say. And so how do you extract that introvert to engage in the conversation? So you talk about diversity, like there's the introverts, extroverts. Extroverts always have a very loud point of view, share their point of view, but sometimes it's that person in the corner that is afraid to speak up that has a brilliant solution to a particular problem.
You mentioned IDEO, and IDEO is one of my favorite companies. I'm such a fan of them. I lived in San Francisco for a long time, and I feel like the design think mentality that's at the core of IDEO essentially is part of Bay Area mentality, whether you're in a school or a museum or a tech company. Everyone sort of design thinks their way through problems, which inherently explores diversity and inclusivity, like you just described. So I wonder if it's like a societal thing that takes time to mind shift. And on that point, I'd love to talk about mind shifting. What's hardest and what's easiest about shifting minds?
I mean, there's multiple things is that you have to take all the conditioning to recondition. And that's a lot of work. So for most of my life, I'm gonna give you a perfect example, which is not necessarily about inclusivity, but just I'm Mexican. Culturally, I was brought up to respect elders. And if you bring that into the corporate workplace, it means that I'm not here to challenge my management. I'm not here to challenge the point of view of anybody plus one above my leadership grade. So when I was moving from individual contributor to manager and had the responsibility to provide a perspective, that mind shift of being able to challenge my executive ranks took 3 years of unconditioning of the notion of respect that you don't challenge elders to recondition myself and say, no, I was hired on for a very specific reason. I have experiences. I have a point of view that this is why they hired me. And in Silicon Valley and in most technology companies, we're not yes people. Like, open to listening to different ideas. I've been fortunate to work at magical companies, whether it's Intel or Microsoft, where different perspectives are appreciated. Constructive confrontation at Intel was valued so that you get the best end product. And so I do think it's hard because you have to recondition yourself. And it takes time. And you think about like the IDEO scenario, and I learned it through them in terms of surround yourself with diversity. And it's always this whole thing around like, you're the average of 6 people you know. And I always think about, I look at my network, am I moving myself outside of the tech industry enough so I can come in and solve problems differently? And so I pride myself once a month. I look at my network and I'm like, how do I expand it? How do I learn? How do I grow? The world is always changing and evolving, and I need to change and evolve with it. So like the curiosity of like the next generation, how do they think? What do they do? And you and I were out last night walking with my daughter, and I was just observing her, and I was kind of doing ethnography research, anthropology, to see how she interacts, because she's going to be the future consumer. And how do I take those moments?
She was soaking everything in. Yeah. Where you and I were just talking, and she was just very observant, but you could tell it was impacting her. She was just quiet where we were talking.
And she was not even looking at her phone. Her phone was put away. So it was one of those really interesting things about maybe the next generation is about being present. Maybe it's about less technology. If it's about less technology, it actually affects our industry. So thinking about all those various elements.
So studies show that diversity and inclusivity is not just a box that we should check because we want to be good humans. It's been proven to make products better because the different mindsets will address problems in different ways, which will give you newer and more solutions. And yet there's still a resistance to do that. So how do we, is it a cultural thing? Is it a cultural problem? Do you have to, have a willing C-suite to then work on cultural shifts? You didn't answer what the easy part of mind shifting is. So in that context,
When I was at the previous session, Donna brought this up, the CEO of LoRa Alliance, and I 100% agree with her. It starts at the top. It simply starts at the top. You, as a leader, you're responsible to drive followers, and followers observe your behavior and action. And if the C-suite or board of directors is not diverse, what incentive does the next person in line have? And so, from my point, the way it's going to happen is through C-suite and the board of directors. And oftentimes, like when you think about, if you're not going through executive recruiting firms and you're seeking to hire somebody or a smaller mid-sized company, you go through your network. Well, most of your network in the tech industry or whatever industry you're in is predominantly male, right? Or you go to the person that you know, and if your network is predominantly, people that you associate with that are similar interest, it's going to be most likely male. And so we just have to keep on. I keep on saying, like, just it's a keep on fighting the good fight. It's not it's not about us saying men are bad. That's not true. It's just about us saying, just give us a shot, and make sure that oftentimes when we are given a shot at a CEO level is because the company is so distraught. And our chance of turning that around is very, very difficult. You look at Marissa Mayer at Yahoo. Like, there's so many different examples of where a woman was put at the helm because the company was in disarray, and the success of that person changing the company, male or female, whoever's leading it, is very low. And so we just got to give females more opportunities to help, and other types of diversity that exist to help kind of drive change, and ultimately it's just for a better world.
So what's your strategy for driving change at Microsoft?
Like I said, it starts with the leader. So I always look at my team as like, does my team reflect society? Do I have multi-ethnicity, multi-gender? Do I have people that relate to, gay, lesbian, and they, and are agnostic? Do I have people with disability? Do I have people that are dealing with mental illness? So I always look about, like, I can't challenge the C-level if my group is not diverse. I can't talk about equity and, salaries if my team is not that reflection. And so I always tell people, like, it just starts with one person, and then you get the network effect. If I can build a high-performing team illustrating how we had such a great conversation on something strategy, and it was so much tension, but the output was so much better, that's a case in point. And so it's a journey. It's going to be a multi-decade journey. So ultimately, we will see the advancements of various people in different roles. And so that's how I believe I will drive change. And then, of course, whenever there's an opportunity to speak about it, if I could just, like, drop a seed of, like, why. Like, this is why when we were talking about the discussion over there, I'm like, I'm not going to do stats. Everybody's seen the stats. Everybody's seen the case studies. Let's just show real case studies of product design opportunities that existed, that business opportunities were left on the table. That's quite simple.
You mentioned a seed, and for me, mind shifting can feel really difficult and overwhelming if you're talking at an organizational level. But then there is that moment, there's that seed or that tiny shift that just pushes momentum in a different direction and keeps it going that way. So it's fascinating, really.
Or, like, self-awareness. I mean, this happened this morning, literally. I was going to IDEO just because I wanted to be inspired. I was reading, you were there, I was reading an article, and I was like, oh, this is a really great article. I'm going to go see Let me go find his name and who published the article. And this is the unconscious bias. It was a woman. And so I sent her a LinkedIn. I said, thank you for the gift that you didn't even made me realize is my unconscious bias, my assumption that it was a male that wrote that article. And, I'm an active feminist, and I always for equal rights. And that
I think admitting that we have unconscious bias is really important because all of us do, no matter who you are.
right.
But it's good to note it when you realize it and question yourself and almost design think your way into that solution. Like question. I'm very visceral, so I always have an opinion right away on something. And living in the Bay Area has made me note that idea because it's usually good, but not all of it and not enough. So I put it on the wall, usually on a Post-it, and then I take a step back and I go around it and usually come up with something better.
Yeah, that's kind of like your conditioning. You become self-aware. What are you going to do differently, and how do you condition yourself, and how do you see that on a continuous basis, so that in your brain, your neurons trigger next time you see it, you've already been conditioned.
So how do we inspire to design for a better world?
I mean, one of the reasons I joined Microsoft is, Satya inspires me, the CEO. A leader that is driving empathy and intelligence into the DNA of the company. And that commercial, this is before I joined Microsoft, where they designed a product for those individuals that do not have hands to play video games, to me, tugged at the heart. It's and you think about how big is that audience, and while maybe relatively small, the opportunity to give somebody a semblance of, in this case, with normality in the context of being able to play a game, that to me is worth so much more. And the valuation of companies for the next generation, where they're looking at values, I think is what's going to drive change and is going to drive preference. And so you think indirectly that commercial connected with people and you appreciated that. And when you think about technologies and your preference, you're going to think about wow, Microsoft is designing for people with disabilities. The next generation cares about values. I'm going to choose to invest in Microsoft over another company that is ignoring that particular segment.
Yes, and Gen Z is already making those decisions.
So Gen Z, values-based, they're willing not to buy a particular company for XYZ. And I think it's really interesting too, corporations are now having to think about values in context of so many things that are happening at a larger society, right? So I often like to think I would never thought in my professional career that we would be talking about societal values that are important, in the United States, Roe versus Wade. Who thought those things would come into a business conversation and share a point of view? What's happening in terms of with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And you think about the war and,
Well, all of that came to surface, and then COVID hit. And
COVID.
I've seen it with the companies I consult for, that their internal communications are all really focused on mental health and feeling connected and trying to sort of bring people back from this COVID PTSD, which is real.
Well, yeah, but society would say, I remember literally 5 years ago, mental health was taboo. If I talk to people, I'm going to go see a therapist, they're like, what's wrong with her? And now everybody talks about, therapy. Nowadays, which I'm so happy, I think one of the greatest gifts about COVID is that we could become more human. It gives me a heartbreak when a male can't have the feelings of being sad, or a male can't cry, because what you get is man up. And I'm like, wait a second, we're all human. Men, females, we can all cry. It's okay. It's a feeling. And so the acceptance, I think, post-COVID, in terms of we're all going through traumatic journeys and kind of working through it. And as a leader, giving people space and understanding that the way people are going to show up in terms of their best version of themselves at work is if you give them the space that they need, whatever it is. If it means a couple days off, if it means like an hour or two off, if it means just reducing the workload, you're going to get a better byproduct. So I do. Corporate America is changing. I do believe humanist is coming into play. We're no robots.
It's trending. Human is trending.
Human,
That's
yes,
true.
it's trendy.
On that note, do we have any questions or comments in the audience?
We can talk forever.
I have one last question for you. You get asked to speak so many times. What's your favorite thing to speak about these days? Or what are you most passionate about?
God, I'm passionate about so many different things. One, I often talk about fashion, sports, music, informs culture. Technology is informing culture. Whether you're in B2B, B2C, it doesn't matter. Whether you're in agriculture, just think about the algorithms or the values that you're interjecting into the algorithms. And so technology has changed culture. Think about what happened with social media. And so with that, anybody in the tech industry, I firmly believe that we have the responsibility to do tech is for good. Satya at Microsoft talks about data as a human right. So that's one thing I'm very passionate about. And, next generation of leaders, I've had amazing mentors and sponsors, many of whom have been men, who have opened the door for me. And so in any way that we could inspire the next generation, if she sees me, she could be it. I'm a very big believer of that. So, a Latina woman, first generation in the United States. My parents did not even know what it meant to go to college, and I figured it all out. And I've had such amazing opportunities that landed where I am today. If I can help the next generation and mentor and sponsor them so that we get to the 1% that represents society at large, I feel like I've done my work on this planet.
Sandra, thank you very much. It was beautiful talking to you today about this really important subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing this conversation forward.